20 things from the 1980s that are no longer socially acceptable today. Think the 80s were all glam and neon? Think again. From chickenpox parties to unlocked doors and kids roaming free, we're diving into the wild, rule-breaking world of 1980s childhood. You won't believe what flew back then. 1980s. Car safety. It's almost hard to believe now, but car safety in the 1980s was practically the Wild West. Kids riding in the front seat? Totally normal. In fact, many children sat right next to the driver, often squished into bench seats or, brace yourself, riding on a parent's lap. And if you were too short to see out the window? No problem. You just stood up on the seat for a better view. No booster seats, no restraints, just vibes. Seatbelts were there, technically, but rarely used, especially in the back seat. Station wagons and pickup trucks became rolling playgrounds, crammed full of kids tumbling around like it was recess. If you were lucky, your parents might buckle you into one of those old-school plastic car seats. But even then, they weren't built for real protection. More often than not, those seats were just there to keep you in one place, not keep you safe in a crash. It's wild to reflect on how far we've come. Today's cars are built like fortresses, and child safety seats are rigorously tested and legally required. What used to be an afterthought is now a priority. And honestly, it's a good thing. We're keeping the next generation much safer than we ever were. Smoking in public spaces. It's almost unthinkable today, but in the 1980s, smoking wasn't just common. It was practically everywhere. Picture this. You're sitting down in a restaurant, riding in the backseat of a car, or even buckling up on an airplane, and someone nearby just lights up a cigarette like it's no big deal. That was normal back then. There were no real restrictions. In fact, if you boarded a flight, the flight attendant would ask, smoking or non-smoking, as if it were a meal preference. Ashtrays were built into every single seat armrest. And yes, there were so-called smoking sections on planes, but smoke didn't exactly stay in one place. Secondhand smoke was just a fact of life, and hardly anyone gave it a second thought. Kids grew up surrounded by it, in the house, in restaurants, even in waiting rooms. And cigarette vending machines? They were everywhere, often placed right outside stores or next to arcade games. No ID needed. Just insert some coins, push a button, and out popped a pack. Some kids were even sent to buy cigarettes for their parents with just a handwritten note and maybe a blank check. Looking back, it's wild to see just how drastically public attitudes towards smoking have changed. Leaving kids in the car. This one might be hard to imagine today, but in the 1980s, it was pretty normal for parents to leave their kids alone in the car while they ran errands. Seriously, picture a crowded station wagon full of restless kids. Windows cracked open while mom popped into the grocery store, or dad grabbed something from the hardware shop. No babysitter, no cell phone check-ins, just a stay put, I'll be right back. Back then it wasn't considered reckless. It was practical. Life moved at a different pace, and there was a strong sense of community and trust in neighborhoods. Parents believed the kids would be fine for a few minutes, especially if the car was parked in a familiar, busy place. Sometimes older siblings were put in charge. Other times, kids just entertained themselves by fighting over the front seat or digging for snacks in the glove box. Of course, today we know how risky that can be. From car thefts to heat stroke, leaving a child alone in a vehicle even briefly is considered a serious danger. It's not just frowned upon, it's illegal in many places. This shift shows how parenting norms and public awareness have evolved. What once seemed harmless is now a clear red flag for safety-conscious parents. Drinking and driving. In the 1980s, attitudes toward alcohol were a far cry from what we know today. While no one was handing kids a cold one, it wasn't all that unusual for parents to offer their child a tiny sip of beer or wine, usually just to satisfy curiosity. It seemed harmless enough at the time, part of a more relaxed approach to parenting. But the real danger wasn't in the sip. It was behind the wheel. Drinking and driving was shockingly normalized. It wasn't just something that happened, it was something many people expected. you'd hear people casually say things like, "I'm good for one more drink before heading out." Some folks even joked about measuring their trips by how many beers they could drink along the way. Beer cans in the back seat? Totally normal. And designated drivers? That concept hadn't quite caught on yet. Bars thrived, and after-hours traffic was filled with drivers who were far from sober. Police enforcement was lax, and public awareness was limited. It wasn't until groups like MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, began gaining traction in the late 80s that the tide started to turn. 1980s free-range childhood. The freedom of childhood in the 1980s. There was nothing quite like it. Back then, kids weren't just allowed to roam, they were expected to. You'd tell your parents you were heading out to play, and that was usually the last they'd hear from you until dinner. Maybe. No check-ins, no GPS tracking, no cell phones. Just you, your bike, and an entire neighborhood to explore. We rode without helmets, skinned our knees regularly, and thought nothing of it. The streets were alive with the sound of kids playing tag, building ramps, and riding in packs. Parks turned into kingdoms, woods became battlegrounds, and cul-de-sacs hosted spontaneous games of kickball. If you needed to call home but didn't have a quarter, you just made a collect call from a payphone and hoped your parents accepted the charges. Or better yet, you'd sneak your message into the recorded name, "Mom, come pick me up." Streetlights were our only curfew. Once they flickered on, it was your cue to pedal home fast. It was a childhood built on trust, imagination, and a sense of independence that's hard to find today. No constant supervision, just pure adventure, and somehow, we made it out okay. Maybe even better for it. Do you think times have changed for the better or worse? Share your opinion below. Latchkey Kids. 20 things from the 1980s that are no longer socially acceptable today. Think the 80s were all glam and neon? Think again. From chickenpox parties to unlocked doors and kids roaming free, we're diving into the wild, rule-breaking world of 1980s childhood. You won't believe what flew back then. 1980s. Car safety. It's almost hard to believe now, but car safety in the 1980s was practically the Wild West. Kids riding in the front seat? Totally normal. In fact, many children sat right next to the driver, often squished into bench seats or, brace yourself, riding on a parent's lap. And if you were too short to see out the window? No problem. You just stood up on the seat for a better view. No booster seats, no restraints, just vibes. Seatbelts were there, technically, but rarely used, especially in the back seat. Station wagons and pickup trucks became rolling playgrounds, crammed full of kids tumbling around like it was recess. If you were lucky, your parents might buckle you into one of those old-school plastic car seats. But even then, they weren't built. Corporal Punishment. Back in the 1980s, corporal punishment wasn't just common. It was widely accepted as the go-to method for disciplining kids, both at home and in schools. Spanking, paddling, or a swift slap on the backside were seen as normal reactions to bad behavior. Whether it was a child talking back, acting out in class, or breaking the rules at home, a physical response was often the answer. Teachers kept wooden paddles within reach, and many parents didn't think twice about using a belt or their hand to teach a lesson. The prevailing belief was that physical discipline built character, enforced obedience, and showed children the consequences of stepping out of line. It was rarely questioned, and those who received it were expected to simply accept it and move on. Spare the rod, spoil the child was more than just a saying, it was a parenting philosophy. But over time, attitudes began to shift. Research started to reveal the emotional scars that physical punishment could leave behind, from anxiety to aggression and lowered self-esteem. Today, many parents and educators advocate for positive discipline, methods that focus on teaching, empathy, and understanding. Hitchhiking. You could often spot people standing on the shoulder of highways, thumb out, backpack slung over one shoulder, hoping for a ride. For many, especially young adults, it was an affordable way to travel and a gateway to adventure. there wasn't the same fear or suspicion we see today. Instead, there was a kind of unspoken trust, a belief that strangers were more likely to help than harm. People of all ages hitchhiked, from college students trekking across the country to servicemen trying to get home for the weekend. In fact, if you saw someone in uniform, it was almost expected that you'd pull over and offer a lift. It was viewed as a gesture of respect and a civic duty. Hitchhiking wasn't just practical. It symbolized a time when communities were more tightly knit and acts of kindness were part of everyday life. Peanut allergies. In the 1980s, peanut allergies were around, but the awareness and precautions we see today were almost non-existent. Kids brought peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to school by the dozen, along with peanut butter crackers, granola bars, and even homemade cookies filled with nuts. Classrooms weren't marked peanut-free, and lunch tables weren't separated by allergy risk. For most people, peanuts were just a snack, not a potential life-threatening hazard. The reality, though, was much more serious for those who did have allergies. The EpiPen, now a standard emergency tool for allergic reactions, wasn't even available until 1987. And even then, many schools and families didn't know how or when to use it. If a child had a severe reaction, what we now know as anaphylaxis, the options were limited and emergency care could come too late. It wasn't just a lack of medication, it was a lack of understanding. Parents, teachers, and even doctors didn't always recognize the warning signs or know how to respond. Fast forward to today, and the contrast is striking. From clear food labeling to allergy-safe zones in schools, society has made huge strides in protecting those with food allergies. Chickenpox parties. Back in the 1980s, before vaccines were widely available for chickenpox, parents took a very different and now shocking approach to immunity. They threw chickenpox parties. Yes, actual gatherings where one sick child became the unintentional host, and all the other neighborhood kids were invited over to catch the virus. It sounds bizarre today, but it was rooted in the belief that it was better to get chickenpox out of the way early when symptoms were usually milder, rather than risk facing it as an adult, when complications could be more serious. These weren't exactly festive events, no balloons or cake, but they were organized with a purpose. If one child broke out in itchy red spots, phone calls were made, and soon a small group of unvaccinated kids would be playing together, sharing toys, snacks, and germs. For parents, it was just part of managing childhood. But times have changed. With the introduction of the chickenpox vaccine in the mid-1990s, there's now a safe and effective way to prevent the illness entirely. Today, intentionally exposing kids to chickenpox is discouraged by health professionals, and for good reason. Thank you for watching. To continue with more content, comment 1 to let us know you're still following. Men wearing crop tops. Believe it or not, crop tops weren't just a women's fashion statement in the 1980s. Guys wore them too, and they wore them proudly. Back then, it wasn't out of place to see men showing off their abs in cropped tees or mesh tops, especially in the world of fitness and sports. It was all about confidence and showing off the hard work put in at the gym. For many, the crop top was a symbol of athleticism and bold personal style. What's even more surprising is that male crop tops were sometimes part of school athletics. High school and college football teams often used cutoff jerseys as practice wear. These half shirts not only kept players cool during intense workouts, but also made it easier to spot teammates. It became a quirky but accepted part of sports culture. The trend challenged traditional ideas of masculinity and fashion. Back then, it wasn't seen as controversial. It was just another way for men to express themselves. Fast forward to today, and male crop tops are much rarer, though they occasionally pop up in retro-inspired streetwear. Hanging out at the mall. In the 1980s, the mall wasn't just a shopping center. It was the social playground for teenagers. If you were a teen back then, chances are you spent countless Saturdays roaming the food court, flipping through cassette tapes at the music store, or trying on the latest fashions with your friends. It was the real-world version of what social media is today, except instead of likes and comments, You got smiles, laughs, and real conversations. Parents would drop their kids off at the mall with a few bucks in their pockets and trust them to spend the day however they pleased. No cell phones, no trackers, just an unspoken rule to be back at the pickup spot by a certain time. Teens met up at the mall to flirt, gossip, and catch a movie or slice of pizza. It wasn't about shopping as much as it was about being seen and being social. Today, malls still stand, but their cultural role has faded. Social interaction has shifted to digital platforms, and teens are more likely to meet in a game lobby than under the neon lights of a mall atrium. Fanny Packs. In the 1980s, no travel outfit was complete without one iconic accessory, the fanny pack. But here's the twist. People didn't always wear them on the front. In fact, slinging them around to the back was actually the fashion move of the time. It looked cool, a little sporty, and totally fit the laid-back vibe of the decade. But there was a downside. Turning that pack around made it a much easier target for pickpockets, especially in crowded tourist spots. Still, the fanny pack was a game-changer when it came to practicality. It gave you a hands-free way to carry all your daily essentials: cash, maps, hotel keys, sunglasses, without lugging around a bulky bag. Tourists loved them. So did joggers, bikers, and even parents at amusement parks. They were the perfect solution for staying mobile while keeping everything close. Over time, the fanny pack went from cool to cringeworthy, often mocked as a fashion faux pas. But fashion always finds its way back. Today's fanny packs, now rebranded as belt bags or waist packs, have made a serious comeback with sleeker designs and street-style flair. The 80s may have launched them, but modern fashion gave them a second life. Bell bottoms. Bell bottoms made a bold comeback in the 1980s, riding the wave of nostalgia from the groovy 1970s. With their dramatic wide-leg flair, they became a signature piece in closets across the country. Whether you were a trendsetter hitting the dance floor or just a teenager heading to school, bell bottoms were the fashion statement that said you were in the know. They were often paired with platform shoes, bold patterns, or tucked-in tees, creating that unmistakable silhouette that screamed confidence and cool. But as quickly as they soared back into fashion, bell bottoms began to fall out of favor. The style gradually gave way to a more toned-down version: flared pants. These kept the essence of bell bottoms, but dialed back the drama, offering a more versatile and slightly sleeker look. For many, flared pants felt like a more modern twist, bridging the gap between bold 70s nostalgia and emerging 80s minimalism. The mullets. Few hairstyles are as instantly recognizable or as closely tied to the 1980s as the mullet. With its signature look of short in the front and on the sides and long flowing locks in the back, the mullet became more than just a haircut. It was a cultural phenomenon. People would walk into salons and jokingly ask for business in the front, party in the back, perfectly summing up the dual personality of the style. It was edgy, rebellious, and unapologetically unique. A popular variation, often dubbed hockey hair, gained traction among athletes, especially hockey players. With a wilder, shaggier back, it was said to take inspiration from Viking warriors, adding a rugged, fearless flair. From rock stars and wrestlers to suburban dads and school kids, the mullet crossed social and professional lines with ease. Though the trend faded in the 90s and early 2000s, often becoming the butt of jokes, it never fully disappeared. In recent years, the mullet has staged a surprising comeback, embraced with a mix of irony, nostalgia, and fresh stylistic spins. Whether worn sincerely or as a throwback, the mullet continues to turn heads. Shoulder pads. If there's one fashion statement that screams 1980s, it's the mighty shoulder pad. These padded inserts weren't just a detail, they were everywhere. From blazers and jackets to sweaters, dresses, and even the occasional t-shirt, shoulder pads were a defining feature of the decade's bold aesthetic. The idea was to create a commanding silhouette: broad, squared shoulders paired with a tapered waist. it wasn't just about style, it was about power. For many women entering the workforce, shoulder pads symbolized confidence, authority, and a no-nonsense presence in boardrooms traditionally dominated by men. They made clothes hang with structure, giving outfits a crisp, tailored feel that felt sophisticated and polished. But not everyone was on board. Critics said the pads looked awkward or boxy. Some compared them to football gear or marching band uniforms. Others simply found them uncomfortable or too exaggerated for their taste. Which of these 1980s things shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Talking to strangers. Long before smartphones and social media took over our attention, talking to strangers was just something people did, every day and almost everywhere. In the 1980s, casual conversations with people you'd never met before were a natural part of American life. Whether you were in line at the grocery store, sitting at a bus stop, or grabbing a cup of coffee, it wasn't unusual for someone to strike up a friendly chat about the weather, sports, or whatever was happening that day. There was a shared sense of ease and openness that feels almost rare now. Kids growing up in the 80s might remember watching their dads talk with total strangers for 10-15 minutes like they were old friends. And in places like Texas, that warm, talk-to-anyone attitude was practically a way of life. It wasn't about small talk, it was about community. These moments helped people feel connected, even if only briefly. But with the rise of smartphones, earbuds, and endless scrolling, we've gotten used to tuning out the world around us. Today, we're often more engaged with our screens than the people next to us. Bullying the nerds. Bullying was a painful reality for many kids growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. Despite the nostalgic glow that often surrounds those decades, the truth is that being different, whether you loved sci-fi, fantasy, or got good grades, could make you a target. Labels like nerd or dork weren't tossed around playfully. They carried real weight, often leading to social exclusion and ridicule. For many, the school bus ride was a daily gauntlet, where teasing could quickly turn to verbal abuse or worse, with nowhere to escape and no one stepping in. Back then, bullying was often brushed off as a normal part of growing up. Teachers and parents rarely intervened unless things got physical. And even then, it was often chalked up to boys being boys, or kids being kids. Those on the receiving end were expected to toughen up or fight back, and many carried the emotional scars quietly into adulthood. Thankfully, times have changed. Schools now have anti-bullying programs, and society as a whole has a deeper understanding of the long-term damage bullying can cause. Looking back on the struggles of bullied kids in the past reminds us how far we've come, and how important it is to keep fostering kindness, empathy, and inclusion for every generation. Large pet ownership. In the 1980s, owning a pet, especially a large or exotic one, was often seen as a status symbol. Whether it was a colorful parrot, a boa constrictor, or even a monkey, having an unusual pet gave people a sense of prestige. But behind the fascination and flair, there were some serious gaps in understanding how to properly care for these animals. It wasn't uncommon to see exotic birds kept in cramped cages that didn't allow them to fly or stretch their wings, or reptiles housed in tiny tanks with minimal lighting or stimulation. Back then, animal welfare wasn't yet the major concern it is today. Most people simply didn't know better, and the information about species-specific needs wasn't as widely available. Enrichment, mental stimulation, and habitat quality were rarely part of the conversation. Fortunately, the 1980s also saw the beginning of change. Rescue organizations and wildlife rehabilitation centers started gaining traction, raising awareness about proper care and ethical treatment. Breeding programs for endangered species also began to focus more on conservation rather than collection. Unannounced visits. In the 1980s, social life had a wonderfully spontaneous rhythm to it. Teenagers and even adults thought nothing of showing up at a friend's house unannounced. It was just how people connected. You didn't need to call ahead or send a text. You simply hopped on your bike or drove over and knocked on the door. If your friend was home, great. If not, you tried someone else. Homes with swimming pools were especially popular hangouts on hot afternoons, where kids would gather for impromptu pool parties that needed no planning. Life in the 80s felt less structured and more relaxed. There weren't packed schedules or back-to-back commitments. With most stores closed on Sundays and no online distractions, free time was spent with people, face-to-face. Socializing wasn't something you scheduled 2 weeks in advance. It happened naturally as part of everyday life. This casual approach also took pressure off homemakers. People didn't expect a spotless house or a prepared snack. You opened the door, grabbed a soda, and hung out. Today's world may run on digital invites and busy calendars, but back then, friendships often started with a knock on the door and a simple, "Hey, want to hang out?" It was effortless, and that's what made it special. Unlocked doors. In the suburban neighborhoods of the 1980s, leaving your front door unlocked wasn't just common, it was expected. Whether it was during the day or overnight, many families felt safe enough to let their guard down, trusting that their neighbors would look out for them. It was a time when communities were close-knit, and everyone seemed to know everyone. Kids played freely on the streets, neighbors borrowed sugar without hesitation, and an unlocked door was a symbol of openness and trust. Some homes even had quirky features like milk doors, small built-in compartments for the milkman to make his deliveries without disturbing the household. And yes, there were plenty of funny moments too, like walking into your kitchen and finding the neighbor's kid helping themselves to a snack. No one thinking much of it. But by the late 80s, times were starting to change. Rising crime rates and shifting societal norms led to a greater sense of caution. Locks clicked into place more often, and security systems started becoming household staples. Finger guns. In the 1980s, finger guns were practically a rite of passage for kids. Just a pair of pointed index fingers and some enthusiastic pew-pew sounds, and suddenly you were the star of your own action movie. Inspired by the blockbuster heroes of the day, think Schwarzenegger, Stallone, or Chuck Norris, kids turned playgrounds and backyards into imaginary battlegrounds, complete with dramatic shootouts, exaggerated reloads, and over-the-top sound effects. Adults weren't immune to the charm of finger guns either. They'd sometimes use them as a playful way to tease kids, break the ice, or throw a joking "gotcha" gesture across a room. And there was even a certain unwritten code to it all. The classic double finger guns, both hands, thumbs up, click click, were typically used as a cheeky way to call someone out or give a playful, "you're in trouble now" look. It was all harmless fun, a reflection of a time when childhood play was powered more by imagination than screens or schedules. Games weren't always structured, and toys didn't need batteries. Finger guns were a simple, spontaneous prop in a world where creativity ruled. Looking back, they remind us of a time when play was unfiltered, social, and purely about joy. Physical punishment for kids. In the 1980s, physical punishment was still widely viewed as a legitimate and even necessary form of discipline, both in the home and at school. It wasn't unusual for schools to send home permission slips allowing teachers or administrators to use corporal punishment on students who stepped out of line. And many parents signed them without hesitation. The philosophy back then was simple. Discipline through physical consequences would build character and respect for authority. Teachers, principals, and coaches often kept paddles within reach, and some used even more unorthodox items like paint rollers or wooden rulers to deliver punishment. A sharp smack on the hand with a strap, or a few swats with a paddle, was considered fair correction for talking back, goofing off, or missing homework. It wasn't seen as abuse, it was just part of how kids were raised. Today, those methods feel shocking, even disturbing, but at the time, they were normalized and rarely questioned. Since then, our understanding of child psychology and emotional development has grown. Research has shown that physical punishment can leave lasting emotional scars and even increase aggression. As a result, modern parenting and education have shifted toward approaches that emphasize empathy, communication, and positive reinforcement. A clear sign of progress in how we nurture and guide children. What do you remember most about growing up in the 80s? Drop it in the comments. If this trip down memory lane brought back some feels, check out more episodes from Past Not Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who lived it too. Thanks for watching.